Hey guys, tonight we follow a thin blue thread of smoke through the dark, the kind that curls like a cat and pretends it isn't headed anywhere in particular. Your pillow finds the cool side, your fan hums a low road note, and on that sound we ride back toward tents that glow like lanterns, mountain passes with breath like frost, and little fires that teach big lessons. We're chasing the moment when people stopped letting smoke escape and started inviting it in, on purpose, by design, with a sly grin. Small warning, you probably won't survive this, at least not as a fully awake person, because I'll keep the pace easy, the images soft, and your eyelids obedient. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. In the comments, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love watching the world map bloom with midnight dots. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You keep breathing with the fan as we set our first rule. Tonight, weed means cannabis chosen for what it does to a mood, not just for rope, sail, or soup. Mainstream historical fact. Long before anyone courts euphoria, people across Eurasia are already twisting hemp fiber into cord and cloth, pressing oil for lamps and cooking, and sprinkling seeds into dough that needs help on cold days. Imagine a shipyard. Tar-dark seams, hemp oakum tamped into planks so a boat stops pretending to be a bathtub. That's your first gentle joke. Once upon a time, weed saves the weekend meant the cargo arrived dry. But our question isn't, what is this plant good for? It's the narrower one that glows like an ember. When do people start inhaling it for effect? To answer, we have to be picky about words. Is smoking only pipes and rolled papers, or do tents full of hot stones and fragrant plant bits count? Historians still argue whether leaning over heated rocks to breathe rising vapors equals smoke in the strict sense, or whether it's closer to a ritual sauna, an incense bath, a spa day with opinions. You smile in the dark. Language is a fussy roommate, but it will learn to share. So we set a scale, a little slider you move with your thumb. On the left, fumigation, where heat kisses plant matter and the air grows heavy, often in a closed space on purpose. In the middle, glowing braziers, wood or stone, where embers live below sightline and vapors rise like rumors. On the right, pipes, bowls, and water contraptions that recruit your breath as a tool. Tonight, anywhere on that slider where people deliberately breathe what heat makes, that's close enough to smoking to keep our story warm and honest. Quirky tidbit to tuck under your cheek. Somewhere in a courtyard, a practical aunt swears by hemp seed porridge for shinier chickens. Do journals publish it? Of course not. Do the chickens strut like they own the lane? Suspiciously, yes. That's joke number 2, and it reminds you how everyday experiments nudge culture. A blossom falls too close to coals. A curious person leans in. Someone learns that what smells pleasant at arm's length feels different when it arrives by lung. You picture the nightwork of small fires. Hot stones are lifted with tongs that squeak like field mice. A handful of seeds or shredded flour, maybe resinous, maybe not, meets the heat, and a closed shelter becomes a weather of fragrance. Laughter thickens at the edges. Words soften, stretch. The method, stone, ember, enclosed air. Deliberate breath gets repeated often enough that a gesture turns into a habit, and a habit into a rite. The third joke arrives wearing a scholar's cap. If repetition built muscle, historians would be absolutely shredded. But evidence matters, not just vibes, so you plant markers you'll return to later. Graves where braziers keep secrets under soot. Texts that describe tents acting like saunas. Labs that read microscopic residues the way you read a room. Between them sit the things we don't know, and I'll name them so they don't grow teeth. Historians still argue whether early mentions in hymns and pharmacopoeias point to psychoactive strains or polite, hard-working hemp. They still argue whether strong resin was selected on purpose early or discovered by happy accident. The gaps are honest. The smoke will thread them anyway. Keep your pace slow. Let the plant be a co-worker before it becomes a whisperer. Imagine rope coiled by a door where winter pauses to knock, lamp oil steady as a promise, a seed jar with the dignified clatter of future meals. All of that makes the first ember of certain, testable inhalation easier to recognize when we arrive. It will feel bright the way a match feels brighter outdoors at dusk. Small, committed, convincing. For now, the room holds you like warm water. Your breath drifts, even, unhurried. In a few minutes we'll step into tents that chuff like kettles, into mountain cemeteries where chemistry survives the weather, into the human habit of inventing little devices that turn curiosity into ritual. You don't have to pack anything. Just loosen your grip on the day and let the question ride ahead. Not if people inhaled, but when they did it on purpose, and knew exactly what they were doing when the air began to change. You stay with the hum and let the plant step onto the stage without the smoke machine. Before it is a mood, it is a material. You rub imaginary fibers between your fingers, and they don't crumple like drama. They hold. Mainstream historical fact. Long before anyone courts a high, people across Eurasia domesticate cannabis for fiber, oil, and seed, spinning cords, weaving cloth, and pressing lamp fuel that burns with fewer complaints than animal fat. Rope, sail, sack, net. The vocabulary of getting things done. If your toolbox could talk, it would ask for a hemp cape and a day off. The scene widens to shorelines and shipyards. Flakes of pitch speckle forearms. Bundles of hemp are teased into oakum, smeared with tar, and wedged into seams so boats stop pretending to be bathtubs. You picture a sailor patting the hull like a friendly ox and muttering, "Don't leak, we're busy." That's the first joke of the night. In this era, weed saves the weekend, means the cargo arrives dry. Textiles shoulder their way into kitchens and markets. Coarse hemp for work clothes. Finer blends when someone wants to impress the in-laws. You can almost hear the looms clack. A steady metronome keeping time for a family that knows winter will count every stitch. Medicine slips in through a side door. Leaves and flowers lose their anonymity in herbal repertoires, tucked into poultices, tinctures, and teas whose recipes move along footpaths and caravan roads. An elder heats oil with seeds, so the remedy doesn't bully a stomach already tired of being brave. A midwife keeps a sachet for cramps and sleepless nights. An apprentice scribbles notes that scatter across centuries like breadcrumbs only some scholars remember to follow. Quirky tidbit to prop under your cheek. Somewhere, a practical aunt swears by a hemp seed porridge for shinier chickens. Is it peer-reviewed? No. Do the chickens look smug? Absolutely. You run a finger along the boundary between useful plant and interesting evening. Seeds are legal even in the strictest kitchens. Fibers are virtue incarnate. Oils make lamps purr. But flowers, the resinous parts that whisper, you can feel them waiting in the wings like actors pretending they're only there to move props. Historians still argue whether early references in sacred hymns and pharmacopoeias point directly at psychoactive cannabis or at safe, sensible hemp that merely minds its chores. They argue, too, about when selection for stronger effects begins, whether people intentionally favor resinous varieties or just stumble into them the way you stumble into a midnight snack. You imagine a courtyard where the day's work leans against the wall. Coils of rope, folded cloth, jars of oil. A neighbor brings news of a child who slept at last after a tiny spoon of bitter tea. Someone else mutters about a rash soothed by a poultice that smelled like the field in late summer. The plant's reputation fattens without fanfare. This is the part of the story where repetition becomes tradition. The quiet loop of "it helped," told 1,000 ways. None dramatic enough to make a statue, all sturdy enough to keep the statue from tipping over. Food sneaks into the script because seeds are edible, nutty, eager to share their oils. A millstone sighs over a small pile, and you glance up at the ceiling beams the way you did earlier, as if the past had hidden recipes in the wood grain. Someone adds a spoon to dough. Someone else stirs a handful into a stew so thin you could read a fortune through it. The point is not elation, but endurance. Plant a plot, eat the seeds, wear the fiber, light the lamp, sleep, repeat. If the gods invented spreadsheets, this crop would own a tab. Now the second joke lines up like pins in a lane. The phrase, "weed helps productivity," used to be literal. Fields of it, spinning of it, boats floating because of it. You let that sit, because modern ears expect a different punchline. That mismatch is useful. It keeps you from pasting a present habit onto ancient hands. It also sets the stage for the moment, a little later, when someone discovers that heated resin speaks in a softer voice than boiled seed. You tilt toward the workshop again and sniff the air. Not smoke, not yet. Heat is in the background because heat is everywhere. Cooking fires, kiln mouths, lamps, sun-baked stones. If a stray blossom falls near coals, if a curious person leans closer, how many such accidents does it take before a method is born? Historians still argue whether these discoveries were deliberate rituals, lucky stumbles, or shared tricks traded across markets with the same cheer as knife-sharpening tips. You don't need a verdict tonight. You just need to mark how the plant's practical highway develops an intriguing side road. Your third joke arrives on a cart. Sales pitches. Somewhere a merchant hawks a cloth that resists both weather and in-law opinions, while a healer offers a bottle, good for aches, wind, and the poetry of sleeplessness. You smirk in the dark. Copywriting did not begin with the internet. Behind the patter stands a stubborn truth. The plant works in enough small, visible ways that people keep it around, close, familiar. And when something is close and familiar, humans test its limits. Tool, then ritual. Fiber, then fume. You breathe with the fan, remembering our promise to pair those ideas. The rope coiled by the door. The lamp with its mild, well-behaved flame. The seed jar nabbed by a night snack. You're not at the ember yet, but you can hear the backstage crew sliding the brazier into place. When we step into tents and graves and labs, you'll feel the tone change, the way a room hushes when someone strikes the first match. For now, you hold the quiet dignity of a plant that carried water, wind, and work long before it carried a mood. The question you brought to bed softens but stays lit, like a kettle just before it sings. You step into drier air, the kind that crisps the edges of thought and preserves small things longer than they meant to last. The desert is a librarian. Wind files sand into neat drifts, and a low shelf of graves runs east-west like someone underlined the horizon. You're at Yanghai, in the Turpan Basin, where wood darkens in the ground and textiles keep their manners, and a single burial turns the question you carried into something you can almost hold. Your fan at home becomes a memory of wind. The night tilts. You kneel in the dust. What you notice first isn't smoke. There's none. But the careful company the dead man keeps. A cap stitched from felt. A bow that still remembers its curve. Small containers, tidy as lunchboxes. And near the head, a stash of plant material that refuses to be shy. Flowers, leaves, and seeds, recognizably cannabis, saved by aridity and luck. Mainstream historical fact. Archaeologists here found a substantial deposit of cannabis placed deliberately in a burial from the late 1st millennium BCE, well preserved enough that specialists could identify anatomy and chemistry. The plant sits like a footnote that wants promotion, asking you to read it into the main text. But the room, sand, grave, sky, stays quiet about method. The cannabis is present, the person is gone. You give the desert an extra second to speak, and it offers logistics instead of drama. Containers imply storage. Proximity to the head implies intention. Associated gear suggests someone who used special tools and knew special songs, whether as healer, ritualist, or both. You can feel the role without hearing the job title. Quirky tidbit to prop under your cheek. One team notes that the stash was cleaned of extraneous twigs and spiky parts, as if someone curated the good bits the way a modern cousin leaves only the crowd-pleasing snacks in the bowl. The past is tidy when it wants to be. So what was the plan? You picture 3 doors. Behind door 1, the plant is medicine. Ground, steeped, or mixed with fat for salves. A practical toolkit for pain, sleep, spasm, sorrow. Behind door 2, it's ritual. Burned as incense, carried as a symbol, sprinkled where words ask the air to listen. Behind door 3, it's both. Because humans rarely sort our lives into separate boxes unless a museum asks us to. You remember our slider from last time, fumigation to braziers to pipes, and notice how this scene refuses to slide yet. No brazier, no pipe, just supply. Historians still argue whether this deposit signals ingestion, inhalation, or topical use, and whether the variety itself was selected for stronger resin on purpose or merely happened to be potent. The honest phrase, "we don't know yet," earns its chair at the table. You lean closer in imagination and let the lab work flutter past your ear like a polite bat. Botanical structures that separate cannabis from lookalikes, chemical fingerprints that don't vanish entirely, even after centuries of desert patience. The climate helps. Turpan is a dehydrator set on eternity, and the grave acts like a pantry. You think of our earlier ship ropes and lamp oils, how the plant's resume made it a familiar neighbor, and it becomes easy to believe that someone trusted this stash in life, then trusted it to travel with them beyond it. A habit, a cure, a comfort. Each makes sense when a community repeats the story often enough. Your first joke of the night arrives with museum etiquette. Somewhere, a future display label will whisper, "Please do not inhale the exhibit," as if visitors could lean across the glass and time travel through their noses. You grin, and then sober. This is a grave, not a gadget demo. Still, the presence of the plant rearranges the furniture in your head. It shows that access existed, that selection happened, that someone considered the plant valuable enough to tuck in as carefully as a tool or a charm. You run a fingertip over the line between evidence and conclusion, as gently as you'd trace grain on a wooden lid. The line holds. No burn marks on a nearby stone. No residue clinging to the inside of a pipe bowl. No architectural hint of a smoke-friendly chamber. Just the stash, precise and quiet. Historians still argue whether traces of psychoactive compounds detected in comparable contexts elsewhere should be generalized here, or if each site must carry its own burden of proof like a careful porter. You let the caution stand. Sleep and certainty are neighbors who only sometimes share a fence. Night deepens around you, and the grave reshapes into a room you recognize. A bedside drawer, a shelf where a favorite remedy rests, a pouch with something that works. The generosity of the deposit hints at use in life. Not a novelty placed only for the journey. The social role, the healer, the ritual hand, flickers like lamplight on the edge of the scene. You don't need full biography to feel the habit of care. You only need to see what was kept close. Second joke, soft as a folded cloth. If the desert is a librarian, this burial is the book you're allowed to read only in the reading room, under supervision, with clean hands and a pencil. You smile at the sign. No erasing, no adding. The caution suits you. Tonight's script wants you calm, and calm does not grab for answers the ground won't give. What the ground will give is context. The plant is here, curated. The person had a life dense enough with tools and textiles to make the plant's presence meaningful, not random. The region sits astride roots where goods and notions travel. So knowledge doesn't need a passport. It needs a cup of tea and a host with a spare blanket. All of this primes the world for the next step you're gliding toward. The one with embers and enclosures and chemistry that leaves a more talkative trace. Yang Hai is not the first puff. It's the deep breath before someone warms a stone. You stand, slow, sand sighing under your heel, and the fan finds your ear again across centuries. The stash remains where it belongs. Your question keeps walking. You file this grave the way the desert taught you, carefully, and carry forward a simple, sturdy truth. By the time people inhale on purpose and leave proof, they already know this plant well enough to pack it for the road between worlds. You leave the desert reading room and step into a colder wind that keeps a straight face even when the fire doesn't. The ground runs wide here. Step without fences, and your ear catches hooves somewhere you can't see. A circle of felt rises like a pale hillock, a tent with the manners of a traveling house. Inside, stones glow dull red, and a few quick hands move with the confidence of people who've done this 1,000 evenings. This is the scene that a Greek traveler wrote down with relish. A pop-up steam room where plant and heat negotiate in public. Mainstream historical fact. A 5th century BCE author describes steppe people tossing hemp onto red-hot stones inside a felt tent, where the air grows thick and participants shout from the intensity, insisting it rivals any city bath. You can feel the rhythm immediately. Stone, plant, enclosure, breath. The same slider you set earlier leaning hard toward fumigation rather than pipes. The tent is a lung. The stones are its heart. Your job is to watch the pulse slow until you can fall asleep to it. You kneel in the cramped light and notice craft everywhere. The tent's felt is a miracle of hair and patience. The stones are preheated outside so the felt doesn't learn to panic. A shallow bowl protects the floor from spiteful sparks. The plant, sometimes described as seeds, sometimes as hemp more generally, arrives in a small pouch with the practical pride of something that rides well in a saddlebag. Quirky tidbit to prop under your cheek. You imagine someone calling this a mobile spa package and immediately charging extra for deluxe airflow. The steppe invented subscriptions. It just used wind instead of Wi-Fi. What exactly are they breathing? That's where your shoulders relax into honest uncertainty. Seeds alone do not carry the chemistry people chase. Seed heads and resinous bits do. Historians still argue whether the account's wording points to whole flowering tops tossed along with seed, to seed heads with clinging resin, or to aromatic hemp that smells marvelous but stays well behaved. They also argue whether this practice lives mostly after funerals as a cleansing ritual, or whether it appears on ordinary nights when friends need their stories polished and their joints forgiven. Your job tonight isn't to referee. It's to hold the tent flap open long enough to see the pattern repeat. The air changes fast. A sweet, grassy perfume that edges towards something heavier when the heap sizzles. The stone's surface browns like bread. A few sparks try to vote against the felt and are promptly vetoed. Someone laughs the way people laugh when the weather inside a room flips in 10 seconds. You try a mental experiment. Count your breaths and notice how each one becomes deliberate simply because the room asks it to be. That's the hinge we care about. Intentional inhalation. The moment the method stops being smoke wandered by and starts being we invited it. Your first joke glides in with an accent. If you marketed this to urbanites, you'd call it artisanal hot stone aromatherapy, regional ingredients, and sell out in a weekend. But the scene keeps its dignity because everything in here earns its keep. The stones were hauled. The felt was worked. The plant was gathered, maybe selected for character like a musician chosen for a band. Not just any reed, but this one that plays warm when the solo lands. You picture a writer testing bouquets by the fire, squinting like a tea buyer. And you remember our earlier ship ropes and lamp oils, how usefulness builds trust before curiosity builds ritual. The tent fogs until the world outside stops auditioning for your attention. Someone pulls the flap tighter. Another person stirs the heap with a twig that spends its nights doing nothing wrong. A third leans down and inhales as if the air had privacy settings. You're tempted to label everything, but labels arrive late to moving rooms. Was this healing, cleansing, mourning, merrymaking? Historians still argue whether the shouting in that famous description means exhilaration, purification, fervor, or simply, it's very hot in here and we are dramatic. The answer might be yes to all three on different nights. You let the modern urge for gadgets tug once and then set it aside. No pipe bowls pass from hand to hand. No stems clink against a cup. What you have instead is a space engineered to cooperate with heat. That matters. Because when people invent tools later, little bowls, long stems, water chambers, they will be miniaturizing a room, turning architecture into handheld physics. The tent is a blueprint with breath in it. Second joke, quietly pleased with itself. Somewhere, a health club tries to recreate this and ends up with a eucalyptus machine that sounds like a polite dragon. You would still tip the attendant who knows exactly when to lift the flap for one cool draft. The choreography is half the charm. The other half is the way everyone knows the job without being told. When to add a pinch, when to stir, when to breathe less like a customer and more like a neighbor. You check your pockets for the questions we brought from Shanghai, the ones about use without method, and smile to find them meeting their opposite here. Method without a stash to catalog. No grave goods, no curated bundle under glass. Just an ethnographic scene with a good memory. The two stories need each other. The desert's pantry and the steppe's sauna. Supply and technique, storage and steam. Together they pull your slider toward a workable definition of smoking that fits the evidence without bullying it. Third joke steps lightly to avoid waking the fire. If repetition built muscle, the people in this tent could deadlift the horizon. And maybe they do, in a way. Ritual is strength training for meaning. The longer you sit, the easier it is to imagine how this becomes habit, then tradition, then identity. You can almost hear someone years later say, "We do it like this," and answer no further questions. When you finally duck back into the night, the air tastes square again, thin, cold, uncomplicated. The tent glows like a lung you stepped out of. You carry the scene forward to our next embers, where stones give way to braziers that keep better secrets, and to chemistry that stays talkative even after the fire goes out. The wind holds your sleeve for a second like a friend who wants one more story, and you promise it's coming, one ember closer to proof. You climb into thin air where mountains teach lungs to be humble. The Pamir night lays out its constellations like a toolkit, and on a high slope a tidy cemetery steps down the ridge. Stone rings, pebbled mounds, lines you could trace with a mittened finger. You recognize the pattern from our last stops. People, fire, an enclosed space when they can manage it, and the deep human habit of making meaning where breath meets heat. Here, though, the ground has been generous with souvenirs. You kneel beside a low brazier, a small container darkened from use, and you can already smell the lab report hiding in the soot. Mainstream historical fact. In graves from a 1st millennium BCE cemetery on the Pamir, archaeologists recovered braziers whose residues, when tested, contained heat-altered cannabinoids consistent with burning potent cannabis. That's our first sure ember, the one that doesn't just tell you plant was present, but that someone made it smolder and inhaled what it became. Think of it as the moment the story snaps into focus like a camera at dusk. The lens clicks, the air answers. You run a finger along the rim and imagine the choreography. This isn't a bonfire that bullies the night, it's a controlled glow. Coals or hot stones rest in the bowl. Plant matter gets added in small, persuadable amounts, so the vapors arrive tempered, not scorched. Remember that wooden tray from earlier, the one that nests hot rocks so timber doesn't learn to panic? Same spirit here. Small heat, smart container. Quirky tidbit to tuck under your cheek. A few of these braziers are paired with harp-shaped stone supports that look like miniature easels for fire. Pieces so cute a modern store would market them as artisan incense furniture. Picture the ceremony. The graveside is a room without walls. Friends and kin gather, and the brazier becomes the tent's little cousin. The lung shrunk to a bowl. Smoke or vapor. The slider we made is useful again. Rises like a hush. The living breathe together, and the boundary between farewell and welcome blurs just enough to make the world bearable for an evening. Your first joke arrives in wool socks. Somewhere a future health influencer will brand this high-altitude mindful breathing and sell a mat. Up here, mats are rocks, and the breath is shared because grief rarely lets anyone keep their air alone. What makes this stop feel different from Yanghai's stash or the steppe tent is the post-fire proof. In a lab a long way from the wind, a chemist dries a sliver of residue and ushers it through a machine that sorts molecules by behavior. What comes back is not a photograph of smoke, but its fingerprints. Compounds that form when cannabis is heated, some more stable than the flashy stars that did the heavy lifting. You don't need to memorize the alphabet soup. You only need to hear the whisper. Something strong was burned here on purpose. The tent told a story you could smell. The brazier leaves a story you can measure. You glance back at our promise to count plain facts, oddities, and open questions like camp cups. Fact we've poured already. Residues match heat-altered cannabis. Oddity worth warming your hands over. The placement of braziers within or beside graves suggests more than convenience. It hints at a choreography of mourning where breath becomes a bridge. Debates? Plenty. Historians still argue whether the practice here represents community cleansing, communication with the dead, or comfort for the living, and whether the cannabis involved was locally selected for higher resin or acquired through trade because mountain people knew what they liked and were willing to shop. Your second joke leans over the lab bench. If repetition built muscle, residue analysts could bench press a brazier's aisle. They don't. They use quiet machines that listen harder than most of us do. But the point stands. Repetition matters. Multiple braziers, multiple graves. A pattern you can't wave away as an accident. You file that next to our earlier ship ropes and lamp oils. Usefulness first, then habit, then meaning. Here the meaning rides on breath, carried bowl to mouth the way stories travel on evenings. You let the scene play through in slow motion. A small pinch added. A plume that would barely register in a stadium but fills the circumference of a mourning circle. A hand over the bowl to stir the air without scolding the embers. This is technology, even if it never needs a patent. It shrinks architecture to an object. The same way later pipe makers will shrink a brazier even further and hand you a personal room for breath. The blueprint in the tent becomes a device in the graveyard, and from here it's a short road, historically speaking, to pocketable lungs. The mountains tug at your sleeve with a harder question. How often was this about intoxication for its own sake? You're allowed to admit you don't know. Historians still argue whether the primary aim at Pamir graves was ecstatic mourning, ritual purification, or a quieter fragrance of farewell, and whether participants consistently chased psychoactive intensity or merely accepted it as a side effect of a recipe that smelled right and felt solemn. It's possible the dial was adjustable, the way cooks adjust salt, a pinch for atmosphere, a handful for altered speech. Third joke pads in with the gentleness of altitude. If someone tried to do this at sea level in a modern apartment, the smoke alarm would file a protest with the landlord. Up here, the only alarms are stars, and they like it when people breathe together. You keep the pace slow. The fan back home is a timid Pamir wind. Your eyelids find their own braziers and grow warm. When you finally stand, the bowl on the ground looks like a paused sentence. The evidence you needed, the lab-friendly kind, has been set carefully inside it by people who were not trying to impress a chemist, only to keep each other company across a threshold. You carry that thought downhill. That, when did people start smoking weed, is not just a scavenger hunt for the first match, but a map of rooms and bowls where breath was asked to do more than keep one person alive. We found an ember you can trust. Next, that ember will scatter, through routes, rooms, and tools, until the story turns handheld and the definitions try to catch up. You lie very still and let the vocabulary come to you, because words are tools, and tonight we need the smaller wrenches. Smoking feels obvious until you follow it across centuries and watch the shape keep changing like breath on cold glass. You start by holding up the methods to the light, the way a jeweler tilts facets until a hidden line appears. First facet, fumigation. Plant on hot stones or low coals inside an enclosure. Air made deliberately heavy. Breath invited to participate. Second facet, incense. Fragrant material burned so the room, not the lungs, is the primary client. But some of that scented weather inevitably becomes you. Third facet. Brazier. A portable bowl that domesticates heat. Like a tent shrunk to a dish, where adding a pinch affects everyone within arm's length. Fourth facet. Pipe and kin. Bowls, stems, and later water chambers that turn inhalation into a personal device. Your hand, your tool, your portion. You slide these along our familiar scale and feel the gradient instead of a cliff. The tent we visited, hard left. Atmosphere first, lungs as consequence. The Pamir braziers, middle. A shared inhalation with design baked in. Later pipes, right. Individual mouthpieces, controllable dose, physics you can carry. Mainstream historical fact to ground the taxonomy. Handheld pipes and water pipes proliferate in the early modern world alongside tobacco's rise, and once those devices are common, the word smoking in many languages narrows around direct, tool-mediated inhalation. Earlier fumigations keep happening, but dictionaries start dressing for the new favorite guest. You test the terms on your tongue. Is a closed felt tent with hot stones smoking, or is it a sauna that learned a trick? Is a brazier a room in a bowl, or a bowl you mistake for a room? Language wants a fence, practice keeps finding gates. Historians still argue whether fumigation scenes described in classical texts should be counted as smoking in strict typologies, or whether we should reserve the verb for device-mediated inhalation that uses bowls and stems to recruit lungs as active engines. You let the argument hum and return to what you can feel. Intention. When people heat plant material on purpose and breathe what happens as the point, not as a side effect of heating dinner. You're in the neighborhood even if the postal code is fuzzy. You picture a workshop table and lay out the parts. Heat source, ember, stone, coal. Interface, open air, lidded bowl. Pipe with a stem, water jar with a down tube. Material, seed heads, leaves, flowers, resins. Space, open wind, small room, tent, tomb, courtyard. Every variable nudges the experience. An open brazier leaks to the night. A tent amplifies like a drum. A pipe tightens the dialogue until each breath is a sentence. Quirky tidbit to tuck under your cheek. Medieval and early modern houses in some regions vented hearths through louvres, wooden roof vents, whose slats could be angled to sip wind. You imagine an ancestor's cousin leaning under that louvre and thinking, nature's extractor fan, centuries before anyone sold chrome hoods to people named Greg. You rehearse 3 quick jokes the way you check pockets before leaving. If a modern spa offered steppe hot stone aromatherapy, they'd charge extra for authentic dust. A pipe is just a travel-size room with better customer support. If repetition built muscle, the human hand that cups a bowl would have its own gym membership by now. But the taxonomy isn't all giggles. It changes how you weigh evidence. A plant stashed in a grave tells you supply, not necessarily method. A brazier with heat-altered residue tells you smoldering happened, not whether it was ritual purity or recreational punctuation. A pipe bowl with plant signatures whispers private choices. The further right you slide along our scale, the more the design insists on lungs. The further left, the more the room can pretend it's just perfume with opinions. Historians still argue whether incense practices in temples and homes, sometimes smuggled in psychoactive intent, or if such moments are rare exceptions, folded into broader symbolic smoke. Now you flip the jewel and look at dose and control. Fumigation is ambient. You breathe because the room breathes. Braziers invite group calibration, a pinch more for the circle, a pinch less if Granny's here. pipes and chillums formalize the turn-taking that already existed in communal rooms. Breath becomes a ritual unit. 1 draw, 2, pass. And with it come rules, niceties, and the hushed etiquette of waiting your turn while the ember freckles the bowl. Callbacks matter. Remember the step tense choreography of when to lift the flap? A pipe is that choreography miniaturized, a weather system reduced to a thumbprint and a spark. You test modern bias the way you press on a bruise. We tend to imagine smoking as a cylinder with paper and a filter because the last century sold us that geometry. But your story is older and messier. Sometimes the filter is felt walls and -10 air. Sometimes it's a handful of ash lifted as a lid. Sometimes it's water tamed in a jar that burbles like a shy stream. The point isn't to crown one method as the true original. It's to respect the family resemblance across tools that invite heat and breath to collaborate on purpose. Another tidy fact to keep you honest. The verb families in old languages blur air and fire. Latin fumus for smoke. Greek roots that braid steam and breath. Old English that gives us reek and reeky when smoke gets bossy. Words evolve around what people notice most. When tense are common, verbs lean toward room making. When pipes surge, verbs cling to pulling and drawing. Your pillow sinks a little deeper under your ear, as if it approves the grammar. You close the toolbox and leave the categories arranged by use, not by pride. On the left, big rooms that become lungs for many. In the middle, bowls that make a small climate. On the right, instruments that hand breath to individuals like a cup. Where, along that line, smoking begins is both a historian's headache and a storyteller's freedom. Tonight, you keep the circle wide enough to include the tent, the brazier, and the pipe. Because our question isn't who invented the perfect gadget. It's, when did people decide a plant's heated breath belonged inside theirs? The fan at home earns its paycheck with one long exhale. You store the taxonomy where your mind can reach it without standing, because the next rooms we enter will keep asking you to slide the dial and choose your labels gently. You won't get lost. The smoke understands its map. You roll the dial from rooms to hands and feel the world shrink. The tent becomes a bowl. The bowl becomes a mouth-sized physics problem, and suddenly breath is a private instrument you tune with a thumb. Pipes arrive like pocketable lungs. Clay, stone, gourd. Whatever says yes to heat without sulking. Mainstream historical fact. In parts of the Ethiopian highlands, archaeologists have recovered small pipe bowls dated to the late medieval period, whose residues test positive for cannabis compounds altered by heat. A quiet but decisive hint that some old-world smokers weren't waiting for modern gadgets to be invented. The brazier's shared climate has turned portable. The ritual now has a handle. You weigh a bowl in your palm. The rim is dark where embers kissed it, and the interior tells its own layered story, a varnish of many evenings. To make a draw, you need 3 agreements: a cavity for plant, a channel for air, and a person willing to become the bellows. You remember our blueprint from the step tent and smile. A pipe is just a miniature architecture where your lungs do the roof work. Quirky tidbit to tuck under your cheek. In some coastal markets, tinkerers fit coconut shells with cane stems and called the result a water cup that minds its business. The gourd has opinions but also excellent customer service. Routes sprawl around your feet like coiled rope. Ideas slip along the Red Sea and Indian Ocean the way dhows stitch harbors into a single conversation. Afar escarpments to Swahili stone towns, Gujarat to the Horn, merchants who can price a spice by smell and a bowl by the way it cools a breath. You picture a harbor at dusk, masts like bare winter trees, lamps kneeling to the water, someone on a step showing a passerby how to cap a little fire with a thumb and draw slow, so the ember purrs instead of barks. First joke pads in on cat feet. If a modern startup pitched this as personal climate control for your mouth, they'd raise a seed round before breakfast. Across the water and overland, you walk into a courtyard in India some centuries later. The tool is a chillum, a conical clay pipe that sits between the fingers like a small bell. A cloth or hand acts as a filter. The gesture is crisp: pinch, pack, spark, lift, draw. The choreography from our tent, knowing when to add a pinch, when to invite a draft, has simply moved into a hand. Mainstream historical fact to set beside your bowl. Chillums become closely associated with ascetic orders and rural smokers in early modern India. A practice that endures, with rules and blessings and debates that belong to their keepers. Where the brazier offered a circle, the chillum offers a turn, a unit of time and breath you can pass around like a story. The evidence line wobbles as it gets closer to modern centuries, because there are suddenly many burnable things floating through trade. Historians still argue whether the earliest Old World pipes, especially those medieval Ethiopian bowls, were used primarily for cannabis, for local aromatics, or, in later contexts, for the newcomer tobacco, which swaggered into global habit in the wake of the Columbian Exchange. They also argue whether certain residue signatures are ambiguous or contaminated, because dirt is mischievous and lab air has a social life. Your job tonight is not to referee, only to keep the timeline honest. There are pre-tobacco pipes in Africa and Asia, and at least some of them spoke fluent cannabis. You admire the engineering creep. The first lesson a pipe teaches is dose control. A bowl the size of a walnut can turn an evening into chapters. 1 draw, 2, pass. Heat becomes a dial you can feel with your fingertips. Breath becomes a sentence you can punctuate. The second lesson is portability. A pocketable device allows experimentation far from ceremonial rooms. A hillside, a field break, the back step after chores. The third lesson, which humans always learn faster than we admit, is etiquette. There's a way to light and a way to wait. A way to ash without conducting a small meteor shower across your neighbor's blanket. Second joke nods with faux solemnity. If repetition built muscle, the thumb that tamps a bowl would qualify for its own Olympics. You can almost hear an argument on a veranda. Is the water-cooled jar that gurgles like a brook a cousin of the pipe or a different beast entirely? It's the same family. You're just teaching the ember to swim. The hookah will get its spotlight soon, but for now, you watch the simplest pipe do a quiet job. It localizes a weather that used to require a tent. The social math adjusts with it. Fewer materials, smaller space, quicker setup, more places where a small ember makes sense. Behind the tools, you keep people in focus. A craftsman smooths clay with a thumb. One push to define an angle, a twist to set the bore. A traveler buys a stem at one market and a bowl at another. A modular kit centuries before anyone says ecosystem. A friend shows a friend how to draw through the nose for a slower climb. Then laughs because advice always sounds superior in the moment you offer it. Historians still argue whether pipe traditions in the Horn and the subcontinent developed independently from earlier fumigation rites, or evolved directly out of them as materials and markets made it feasible to shrink the room into an object. Either way, the continuity is plain. Heat managed, breath invited, meaning attached. Third joke leans in like a conspirator. Somewhere a city inspector would look at a medieval pipe and say, "That's not up to code." And the pipe would shrug, "I'm up to custom." Custom is the code here, written in thousands of private drafts. A bull's wear ring is a diary. A stem's polish is proof you kept returning to the same solution for the same sort of day. When you pocket the tool, your palm remembers its warmth. The tent's blueprints are truly portable now. Your slider has a new anchor on the right. Device-mediated inhalation with an intimacy that makes evidence more personal and more plentiful. Bowls to test, stems to date, soot to interrogate. From here, the story will learn to burble through water, to blend with tobaccos, to travel oceans, and to sit, improbably polite, in salon chatter. For tonight, let the ember rest. Its echo is a small warmth at the base of your thumb, where breath and tool made their first private handshake. Streets take over where mountains leave off. You feel the city gather itself at dusk, doors crack, lamps bloom, and alleys discover that they were corridors all along. Resin has a city voice, softer than spice, heavier than perfume, the kind of smell that makes a courtyard window think about swinging wider. You follow it past donkey bells and water cellars to a low room with cushions and voices braided close. Someone warms a coal. Someone else touches dark resin to the edge until it softens and sighs. The night is a patient animal that knows how to sit. Mainstream historical fact. From the medieval centuries onward in the Islamic world, Egypt, Syria, the Levant, Anatolia, and beyond, Hashish, the concentrated resin of cannabis, becomes a widely remarked substance in urban life, drawing legal rulings, municipal edicts, and moral treatises that alternately ban it, tolerate it, or treat it as a nuisance that will not pack its bags. Judges write opinions, rulers issue crackdowns, poets write back with couplets that pretend poems are just poems and not weather reports about what the city is inhaling. You recognize the pattern from our slider. Not quite the tense communal fog, not yet the fully privatized pipe culture. Something urban and in between, shared but not sacred, domestic but watchful. A brazier sits like a moon in the center of the room, and the ritual has the choreography you know. Heat first, then touch, then breath. Resin behaves differently than loose herb. It melts before it burns, becomes a ribbon that needs coaxing, not scolding. Quirky tidbit to tuck under your cheek. Shopkeepers who count coins with resin-sweetened fingers eventually develop sticky ledgers, tiny constellations of grit that betray which side of the street sells what. A later scribe curses quietly while scraping the page smooth. The page forgives, and the city keeps its secret badly. The law arrives, belted and alert, then leaves again because the night does not obey on command. Decrees get read in marketplaces. Braziers take the night off, or pretend to. You can feel the civic seesaw. One season brings raids and smashed paraphernalia. The next brings a weary live and let live, so long as doors stay closed and songs don't carry. Historians still argue whether the cycles of prohibition and toleration were primarily moral theater, a way for rulers to perform vigilance, or effective public policy that genuinely changed habits for stretches at a time. They also argue how much of the energy came from religious jurisprudence versus municipal pragmatism, the court versus the street, scripture versus sweepers. Your first joke pads in like a cat that learned to read. Somewhere a magistrate tries to quantify how intoxicated a neighborhood is by measuring the average poem length after midnight. It is the sort of metric a bureaucracy would love, right up until a sober tailor writes a gazel the size of a bridge. You remember our tent, how enclosure made the air a collaborator. Cities build their own tents, rooms within rooms, where smoke becomes a wall thick enough to muffle footsteps in the hall. Musicians find the tempo that flatters the coil of air. Storytellers choose tales that bend time without breaking it. lovers lost and found, wise fools delivering wisdom in crumbs, saints who know exactly which corner the wind prefers. The resin gives conversations a hinge, the hinge slows. You watch a group pass a mouthpiece around a circle and realize the etiquette has settled. The turn exists, even without a pipe. The room itself is the instrument. Your second joke arrives wearing municipal stripes. If repetition built muscle, the clerk who recopies the latest anti-hashish edict every spring would have forearms like ship's rope. He does not. He has ink stains and the resigned wisdom of a man who knows the room is always one door ahead of the law. You lean your head against the cool of a wall and translate the room into our taxonomy. On the left, the old fumigation, incense and braziers for everyone. On the right, the device, pipes that privatize breath. The urban night stands in the middle, shared devices in closed rooms, with doorways doubling as filters. In some quarters, resin gets eaten or drunk in sweets or syrups. Another route that moves the act away from smoke and into kitchens, where laws have to pretend not to smell what they cannot see. Historians still argue whether ingestion predominated in certain cities and periods, or whether smoldered resin remained the favorite because breath is more immediate, easier to dose, and social in a way that pastry is not. A poet declaims a couplet so tight you could button a coat with it. A jurist across town drafts a footnote reminding readers that intention matters. A mother leans out her window and decides the smell is fine until it climbs the stairs toward her children's room. The city negotiates itself into the morning. You think of the Pamir bowl, shared, solemn, and see how habits travel. The brazier becomes less funeral, more evening punctuation. The resin turns a threshold into a porch where hours sit, dangling their legs. Your third joke keeps its shoes off. If a modern wellness blog tried to market this, the headline would read, "Mindful Urban Lantern Time," with notes of cedar. And someone would ask in the comments if the lantern is gluten-free. You smile and then let it fade. The humor keeps the pace friendly, but the room is real. For some, resin is medicine. For pain, for sleep, for the edges that chatter. For others, it's a clock that makes the night less rude, a marker that says, "We earned this hour." You pocket 2 truths before you leave. First, the more crowded the city, the more clever the ritual becomes at hiding in plain sight. Rooms as tools, doors as regulators, hushed knocks as bylaws. Second, meaning keeps outrunning rule books. This is not rebellion with banners. It's habit with slippers. The steps from tent to brazier to pipe are social as much as technical, and the street learns them faster than any judge. By the time you step back into the alley, the lamps are low, and the rumor of dawn begins to edit the sky. The resin fades to a memory of sweetness, law to a memory of posture. Your breath finds the fan at home, and the city, having hummed all night, closes one eye. Roads braid the map into a single long sentence, and you ride the grammar. Pack animals clink like cutlery, caravan bells count the hours, and every pass offers a new verb for trade. Seed sacks sit beside cinnabar and cinnamon, iron billets ride with indigo, and somewhere in that jostle the plant we've been following learns new manners. The silk roads aren't a single ribbon but a mesh, routes on land and sea, and along them ideas behave like hitchhikers. They climb in, tell a joke, and teach you a trick before the next town. Mainstream historical fact. By the first millennium CE, silk, spices, technologies, and crops move across Eurasia via overland corridors and Indian Ocean lanes, carrying not just goods, but rituals and devices. From incense burners and lamps to medical recipes, and smoking paraphernalia that mutate as they travel. You feel the pattern you've learned, heat plus enclosure plus breath, copying itself into new accents. A brazier built for frankincense learns to flirt with resin. A spice spoon becomes a packet measurer. A potter who once made oil lamps experiments with tiny lidded cups that behave like training wheels for a personal ember. You duck into a hearth room off a courtyard in a city that smells like cardamom and wet rope. The family has finished dinner. The ash bed in the corner banked to a drowsy red. An older cousin demonstrates an improvised rig. A small ceramic cup, a shard with 2 notches, a coal pinched like a coin, a pinch of plant set where heat can see it but not scold it. The room is not a tent, the cup is not a pipe, but the physics rhymes. Quirky tidbit to tuck under your cheek. The same cup will pull breakfast duty at dawn, yogurt at the bottom, honey drizzled, because in a practical house even experiments earn their keep. Trade makes accomplices of households. A sailor comes home with a story about a port where water jars burble when people lean close. A merchant brings back a gourd with a drilled stem and just enough instruction to cause a few scorched thumbs before the technique softens. The neighborhood tries things. A boy claims the coal should be smaller. An aunt says the air hole needs a wink, not a yawn. Granddad insists the plant must be drier than your jokes. First joke obliges. If a modern startup marketed this, it would be called Modular Micro Brazier 1.0, Hearth Edition. And the only subscription would be to patience. Objects change when they migrate. The Indian Ocean is a courier who never misses a day. Dhows stitched with coconut fiber zigzag monsoon winds, tying East Africa to Arabia, Persia to Gujarat, Malabar to Ceylon and Sumatra. With pepper and pearls come techniques, each altered by local clay, local fuel, local taste. A red stone works in one kitchen. A burnt coral fragment behaves better in another. Someone swears by date pit charcoal because it burns like a gentleman. Steady, discreet, uninclined to drama. Historians still argue whether these overlapping hearthside rigs represent independent domestic inventions or downscaled imitations of public braziers and temple censors adapted for privacy. The answer may be both. Households are where big tools learn to whisper. Your hand learns new verbs. To cup is to regulate air. To tilt is to lengthen a draw. To roof is to lay a flat shard across a coal so the heat becomes patience instead of ambition. You remember our step tense choreography, when to lift the flap, and see it here in miniature. When to uncover, when to feed the ember, when to wave a book gently like a fan, masquerading as a holy text. Second joke bows. Somewhere a ledger keeps 2 columns, commerce and combustion, and the accountant wonders why household research and development never shows up as a line item. Not every road teaches the same lesson at the same time. In one oasis, resin is eaten in sweets. In another, herb smolders in cups. In a port town, someone fits a reed through a jar and hears their first gurgle. Devices compete without knowing they're in a race. The early water jars feel like cousins of oil lamps that forgot to hold a flame. They let heat do more talking before the breath joins in, like a song with an instrumental intro. You can almost hear arguments arriving with the evening bread. Which method is healthier? Which is holier? Which is cheaper? Which makes a bad day lose its sharp corners fastest? Historians still argue whether water-cooled contraptions evolved primarily for cannabis or for tobacco later, with cannabis simply co-opting a new highway once it was paved. You keep your promise to spot the sober fact, the oddity, and the unanswered question in every room. Fact. Trade routes carried small, replicable tools as reliably as they carried luxury goods. Spoons, cups, lamp forms, and the know-how to combine them into inhalation rigs. Oddity. Families gave these contraptions nicknames. The little neighbor, the moon cup, the whistle, as if naming them domesticated the heat. The unanswered question: how much of this tinkering was private pain management, aches, nerves, sleeplessness, and how much was social punctuation, the audible comma that turns a day into an evening? Answers drift like steam. You catch enough to feel honest. Third joke arrives with a wink. If repetition built muscle, the index finger that tests coal distance would be bench pressing tea trays by spring. Instead, it grows a small callus and an instinct for just enough, which is the domestic version of genius. You step back and see the pattern from above. The Silk Roads didn't just move things, they moved habits, and habits are faster than caravans once they have a foothold. A potter copies a cup and accidentally improves it. A sailor watches a gurgling jar and returns with a version that survives on a drier coast. A healer hears that heating resin under a shard soothes a cough better than smearing it on a cloth, and her clinic becomes a bench near the kitchen, because that's where the heat already lives. The brazier teaches the hearth to edit itself. The tent teaches the cupboard to think like a room. When the house sleeps, the ash bed holds one more ember than it needs, the way a story keeps one more laugh than it used. You ease the cup onto its side, blow once, and watch a thread rise that could belong to any of the towns on your map. Nothing here is factory made, everything here is practice made. And practice, repeated across markets and monsoons, is how a plant's breath becomes part of the furniture. You file the image next to our mountain braziers and city rooms, because from here the devices will formalize: glass, water, valves, stems, and the improvisation of kitchens will graduate to the grammar of salons. You feel the devices finish their apprenticeship and collect their diplomas. Bowls sprout stems, stems meet water, water learns to be a bouncer for heat. The room you once needed becomes glass you can lift, clay you can cradle, a coconut shell that pretends to be a little moon. Hookahs, call them hookah, kalyan, nargil, shisha, whichever passport they're carrying tonight, bubble into the early modern centuries as tobacco strides onto the stage, flashy and noisy, insisting the world learn new ways to inhale. Mainstream historical fact. From the 16th and 17th centuries onward, as tobacco spreads across Asia, North Africa, and the Ottoman world, water pipes and related inhalation devices proliferate, standardizing bowls, hoses, and water jars. Alongside them, chillums keep their simpler promise: clay cone, ember, draw, an older cousin who never felt the need for plumbing. You listen to the physics purr. A coal sits above a perforated screen or a layer of ash. Beneath it a bowl holds leaf or blend. Below that, the downstem disappears into water that burbles like a polite creek each time you draw. The water doesn't purify in any moral sense. It tempers, cooling, humidifying, smoothing the bite the way stew turns sharp vegetables into a choir. Quirky tidbit to tuck under your cheek. In some coasts, the base really is a coconut shell, polished and drilled, a tropical cousin to the brass and glass of quartz, thrifty, buoyant, and suspiciously photogenic centuries before cameras. Blending becomes both art and gossip. Tobacco arrives with bravado, but local habits teach it manners. Someone crumbles a pinch of resin or flour into the bowl, just enough to tint the evening. Someone else experiments with molasses-soaked leaf and swears the sugar makes the hours friendlier. You hear a dozen names for mixes. Some practical, for the cough. Some poetic, two rivers meeting. Some just honest, what we had left. Historians still argue whether early water pipes were designed for tobacco first and only later adopted cannabis admixtures, or whether cannabis fumigation traditions nudged engineers toward water long before leaf from the Americas taught the world to boast. They also argue whether water meaningfully alters harm beyond comfort, a modern question with old anxieties hiding inside it. The etiquette tightens. Coals travel on brass trays balanced like moons. Tongs grip embers with a quiet authority your fingers envy. A cafe boy rotates bowls the way a conductor cues a section. The hose becomes a turn you can hand across a circle without tipping the weather. Mouthpieces sprout removable tips to appease both hygiene and superstition. First joke smiles under the mustache of tradition. If a startup pitched this as collaborative hydration for air, they'd raise funding based solely on the gurgle. Chillums stay in the conversation like a proverb. Where the water pipe makes an evening long, the chillum makes it precise. Pack, spark, draw, bless, pass. Ascetics keep the gesture spare and grounded. Farmers use it as punctuation after work. Travelers like that, it fits in a pocket alongside the flint and jokes they've been telling since a border ago. You hear the continuity from our tent and brazier, the old choreography compressed into a palm. The slider you carry in your head updates its labels: room, bowl, pipe, water pipe, each step a smaller climate with a more adjustable sky. Devices learn to speak place. In the Ottoman world, the Nargile lounges in tiled cafes where tiles keep secrets better than walls do. In Safavid Iran, the kalyan joins courtly afternoon protocols where fruit and politics share plates. In India and the Deccan, the hookah becomes furniture. A status object with stems as tall as a pinion. A way to offer hospitality that arrives already humming. Historians still argue over origin stories with the zeal of proud uncles. Some credit Mughal India and a physician's concern about harsh smoke. Others point to Persian innovations. Others to Arabian tinkerers. Each with artifacts, paintings, and footnotes arranged like proofs. You don't need a single inventor to honor the engineering. Diffusion is a hive mind with very good lung capacity. Blends complicate the record the way sauces complicate recipes. A bowl that smells like tumbak, plain tobacco, today might carry a whisper of last night's resin or charas, and residue analysts a few centuries hence will sigh at us for not labeling our evenings better. Second joke bows toward the lab. If repetition built muscle, the scientist who scrapes bowls for traces would curl dumbbells shaped like tiny clay cones. The water's presence tweaks temperature management, and with it, social tempo. A water pipe wants steady attention. Tap the ash cap, rotate the coal, mind the bubble count. So circles develop new micro-roles. The tender keeping coals civilized, the storyteller using the burble as a metronome, the listener who waits for percussive exhale to finish before adding a punchline. The device becomes a clock that keeps everyone honest about the length of a turn. Call back to our mountain braziers. There, breath kept grief company. Here, breath keeps company company. A softer task, but still a task. The debate you expect slides in like a fourth chair. Did people use these rigs for medicine? To ease pain, quiet cough, soften the edge of sleeplessness? Or for sociability? A way to sand down conversation so everyone fits? Historians still argue whether period edicts against hashish targeted smoke, sweets, or street culture more than substance. Whether bands were effective or just a seasonal performance, whether cafes were engines of dissent or simply rooms where time learned to behave. The safest answer is that cities do not obey single verbs. They converse. Third joke. Barefoot and respectful. A modern wellness blog would call the hookah mindful hydration for breathwork and sell silicone tips in sunset colors. Somewhere, a grandmother would read that, sniff, and fix the coal properly. You trace the through line one more time for your pocket. Tents taught rooms to become lungs. Braziers taught bowls to hold climates. Pipes taught hands to own weather. Water taught heat to use its indoor voice. Tobacco's swagger fueled the boom in hardware. But the old plant kept a seat at the table, sometimes solo, often blended, frequently debated. The gurgle that follows your exhale now is a cousin of every hush we visited. The same collaboration between curiosity and breath. You lean back, let the bubble climb, and store the sound next to the fan at home. From here, the map will jump oceans. Pick up new laws and new myths, and land in salons where a host assures you this is for science, and you decide not to contradict them. The map tips, and the sea takes the sentence. You hear rigging clack like a typewriter, and hemp, our old co-worker, goes back to doing what it did before anyone asked it to sing. It works. Sails need shoulders, ropes need backbone, caulking needs a plant that doesn't sulk in salt. Mainstream historical fact. Old world hemp is carried to the Americas by Europeans in the 16th century. Spaniards planting in Chile by the 1540s and 1550s. Later, English and other colonists mandate or encourage hemp cultivation in North America for rope, sailcloth, and oakum. It's not romance, it's logistics with splinters. The Atlantic is an enormous to-do list, and hemp checks boxes like a champion. You step onto a dock where barrels breathe, and a clerk in a hat too big for his optimism tallies bales. Flax, hemp, cordage. The plant crosses oceans as fiber first, oil second, and only much later, fitfully, regionally, as an evening habit. Remember our earliest chapters, tool before ritual, fiber before fume. The New World copies that order the way a careful scribe copies a heading. No flourishes yet. Ships need rope more than salons need discussion topics. Your first joke arrives with tar on its cuffs. If a colonial governor said, "We need more weed," he meant rigging, not recreation. And the quartermaster nodded like a man who sleeps beside a coil. You walk inland to fields that haven't learned yet how to gossip. Laws sprout with the plants, bounties for hemp, fines for foot dragging, towns measuring output with the same gravity they bring to bridges and taxes. Somewhere a sermon praises the virtue of durable cloth, and mothers mutter that durable cloth still needs mending. Kitchens try hemp seed oil because it mines itself in lamps and doesn't pick fights with lentils. Quirky tidbit to tuck under your cheek. A few enthusiastic pamphleteers swore hemp would improve the morals of rope, as if rope had a nightlife that needed guidance. You picture rope at a tavern, tipping the barkeep for a clean coil. Your nose notices what isn't here. Tobacco is the local celebrity, born on this continent and already conducting global interviews. Pipes, cigars, snuffs. The infrastructure for inhalation culture now has a charismatic, caffeinated anchor. When cannabis does get invited to North American evenings, it often arrives later, sideways, whispered in Spanish or French, sidling in from the Caribbean, Mexico, and port cities. Sometimes as cigarettes that owe their geometry to tobacco's schooling. Historians still argue whether psychoactive cannabis had any pre-Columbian presence in the Americas. The sober answer is no credible evidence. And they argue, too, about when and where 19th and early 20th century practices, plantations, ports, labor camps, army barracks, normalized smoking cannabis for effect. The paper trail is patchy because people with uniforms wrote more than people with hammocks. You spend an evening on a wharf in a Spanish-speaking port where guitars have opinions and breezes steal syllables for sport. A small circle shares a rolled leaf that doesn't smell like straight tobacco. Words like marijuana and ganja hitch rides with workers, sailors, soldiers. Global English hasn't decided which spelling it likes. But newspapers will soon pretend the words arrived with thunderclouds instead of with paydays and pay cuts. Your second joke leans against a bollard. If repetition built muscle, rumor would have abs. On another night, you duck into a New Orleans courtyard, music elbowing jasmine, and hear a story about crewmen from the Gulf mixing herbs with tobacco long before anyone printed a pamphlet about it. Up the coast, apothecaries sell tinctures under tidy labels for pain and sleep. The 19th century treats bottles like polite secrets. The inhalation piece for cannabis in North America, though, remains regional and marginal for a long while, braided with migration, policing, and press panics more than with elite fashion. Historians still argue whether early U.S. laws targeted the plant, the people, or the music that made rooms feel like they belonged to someone else. The answer is never kind and never single. You keep the transoceanic ledger neat. Hemp for industry is the clear, early chapter. Psychoactive smoke is late, local, often learned through neighbors whose languages newspapers treat like thunder. That lag matters for our question because it reminds you how often technology outruns taxonomy. Pipes and cigars flourish for tobacco. Hookahs hum in immigrant cafes. But cannabis doesn't seize the spotlight in mainstream North American lungs until much later. 20th century scenes with posters on dorm walls and moral panics in committee rooms. For centuries, the plant in the Americas wears a work apron more often than a party hat. You step back on deck for a night crossing. The sea sounds like a very confident fan. In the moonwash, continuity glows. Tents, braziers, pipes, water. Each a way to invite heated breath. The Americas inherit the hardware quickly through tobacco and the hardware habits that follow it. Cannabis learns to use those paths the way ivy uses a fence someone else built. Your third joke tightens a knot. If a device had a frequent flyer program, the pipe would have elite status by 1700, and cannabis would be borrowing the lounge pass. You tuck 2 careful notes under your pillow before the watch bell turns the hour. First, the absence of good evidence is not evidence of absence forever, but it is what honest history must live with tonight. No credible pre-contact smoking of cannabis in the Americas. No straight line to pipe traditions here before Europeans arrived with seeds and sailors. Second, when cannabis does move from rope walks to rooms, it does so through ports and borders, in blends and borrowings, often quietly before it becomes loudly debated. The plant's breath has always traveled in company, sometimes with incense, sometimes with tobacco, often with songs. Dawn sketches a thin lemon edge on the water. You think of our mountain braziers, evidence baked into soot, and wish the sea left fingerprints as clearly. It leaves stories instead. And you've learned to respect those too. Work first, then whisper. Sailcloth before salons. Coil before chorus. When you step ashore, the question in your pocket is lighter, not from losing weight, but from getting folded properly. The next rooms you enter will be noisier. Salons that call themselves science. Laboratories that call themselves salons. And the old plant will wear new vowels, sometimes triumphantly, sometimes under indictment. You keep breathing. The rope does its job. So do you. You step off the dock and into rooms that call themselves intelligent. The carpets are persuasive, the chairs have opinions, and everyone has a story they heard from a friend who heard it in Cairo from a man who wore the right ring. Early modern and 19th century salons turn smoke into conversation, even when no coal is lit. A traveler returns with a trunk full of sentences. A club host orders porcelain cups that clink like polite bells. A doctor brings a notebook and the conviction that the human mind is a decent laboratory if you ask it nicely. Mainstream historical fact. By the early mid-19th century, European salons and study circles experiment with cannabis preparations, notably a Paris circle that gathers at a riverside mansion where physicians, painters, and poets taste dawamesk, a North African hashish confection, and compare notes. A physician compiles case histories, a poet drafts an essay with a title that promises paradise and delivers footnotes with a wink. The room smells faintly of pistachio and spice, and of ambition wearing cologne. You study their choreography the way we studied tents and braziers: heat, dose, breath, or in this case, spoon. Resin moves from smoke to sweets and syrups because confectioners did not wait for peer review. The etiquette pivots accordingly. Instead of passing a bowl, guests pass a plate. Instead of tapping ash, someone taps a spoon against porcelain and calls it data. Quirky tidbit to tuck under your cheek. A fashionable recipe pamphlet whispers that proper dawamesk requires rose marmalade, almonds, cinnamon, nutmeg, and a confidence in leisure, a measurement no scale can verify, though the host insists his spoon is calibrated. Not every room is velvet. In barracks tales passed along the docks, soldiers from a certain late 18th century campaign are said to have met hashish cafes abroad and carried home both enthusiasm and warnings. Municipal bands follow like chaperones who arrive after the dance. Historians still argue whether those soldiers truly popularized the habit, or whether their notoriety merely decorated a practice cosmopolitan cities already knew. They also argue how effective the early bands were, urgent policy or moral theater rehearsed for worried audiences. As always, rooms and rules learn each other's steps and pretend they invented them. Polite circles adore myths with travel papers. The one about assassins, whispered as if the word itself arrived perfumed, makes the rounds again. Desert gardens, secret initiations, resin as passport to loyalty. You feel your shoulders rise at the neatness of the tale, and then relax as your better habits return. Historians still argue whether the word's etymology truly binds it to hashish, or whether later storytellers glued romance to a political label and called it proof. You return the myth to its hook like a coat that doesn't fit, and keep your eyes on the furniture that does. Spoons, pipes, notebooks, gossip. The scientific voice gets louder, though it still clears its throat in metaphor. Doctors and naturalists write about dose with the seriousness formerly reserved for eclipses. They list minutes and heartbeats and unexpected similes. They propose therapeutic uses for pain. Spasms, melancholia, the 19th century's foggy country where many patients live. The experiments are earnest, sometimes clumsy, occasionally theatrical. One physician claims he can predict the exact time laughter will begin. Another writes with the patience of a clockmaker and the confidence of a man who believes the mind will behave if offered a schedule. First joke arrives in a lab coat. If repetition built muscle, these note-takers would have biceps shaped like punctuation. Outside the salons, Pharmacies sell tinctures under respectable labels. You picture amber bottles lined like small, obedient soldiers behind glass, each promising relief without comment on evenings. In the same city, a cafe host swears that a single pea of confection will make you hear violins in wallpaper. His competitor calls that nonsense and sells spoons engraved with the word reasonable. You smile. Commerce and caution rehearse the same duet in every century. The salon talk has a favorite trick. It translates smoke into manners. Instead of "I inhaled," you hear "I was presented with a preparation." Instead of "we got giddy," we pursued aesthetic clarity. Call back to our tent, the room that became a lung. Here the sentence is the lung. Metaphors expand until everyone can breathe inside them. A host asks guests to describe time. Someone answers with architecture. Another insists time is a pet with moods. The notes that survive read like postcards from a country that never applied for a flag. And yet, for all the poetry, hardware hums in the background. Pipes are everywhere now. Clay, meerschaum, briar, thanks to tobacco, which trained entire continents to own a draw. Water pipes gurgle in immigrant cafes with their own etiquettes. Chillums travel with mendicants and farmers. Urban circles import resin the way they import fabrics and music. The old plant uses the existing highways, just as we said on the ship. Ivy on a fence someone else built. Historians still argue whether these salons meaningfully reshaped broader practice or were mostly literary curiosities, rooms that loved to hear themselves think, while the real habit stayed where rent was cheaper. Second joke takes a seat on the chaise and behaves. If a modern startup tried to pitch the Paris confection as artisanal cognitive jam, beta, the seed round would arrive in tiny gold spoons, and someone would request a dashboard for vibes. You give the room a half smile and a full breath. The fashion will pass, but the method, dose, wait, describe, will linger in clinics and parlors alike. You check our trio. Fact, oddity, debate. Fact, 19th century European circles, medical and literary, systematically experimented with cannabis preparations and wrote about them. Oddity. Recipes demanded culinary theater as much as pharmacy, with spice lists that read like a poem and spoon sizes that performed morals. Debate. Whether salon narratives clarified pharmacology or muddled it with performance, and whether origin myths from older centuries deserve room key privileges in houses built of evidence. When you step back into the corridor, the air is cooler, as if the house exhaled. You keep the continuity in your pocket. Tents gave us atmosphere. Braziers gave us residue. Pipes and water pipes gave us personal weather. Salons gave us language, the confidence to narrate what breath and plant were doing together. Your fan at home approves with a steady purr. From here, the lights will skew clinical, labs with stricter clocks, and the public square will try laws again, louder and more organized. You keep your stride slow. The story is still a conversation. The room is still learning how to listen. You trade velvet parlors for bright rooms that smell like isopropyl and good intentions. The instruments stand like polite giraffes. Columns, pumps, detectors, lenses with more graduate degrees than anyone at your high school reunion. You're here because tents and braziers told stories your nose could follow. But labs turn those stories into numbers, and numbers are the lullabies of certainty. Soft, repetitive, and occasionally off-key. The bench starts simple. A pinch of soot from a pipe bowl. A smudge scraped from a brazier rim. A grain from a charred wooden tray like the ones you met in the mountains. Solvents do what histories sometimes can't. Extract. The liquid goes to a machine that warms, separates, and whispers. This molecule ran fast. That one jogged. This third took the scenic route. Mainstream historical fact. Analysts have identified heat-altered cannabinoids in archaeological residues, compounds formed or preserved when cannabis is heated, which strongly imply deliberate warming and inhalation, not just storage. The lab can't replay the smoke, but it knows the fingerprints of the party that happened. You lean closer as another tool speaks in different grammar. Under a microscope, a smear of residue becomes a landscape. Trichome ghosts, those tiny resin factories, sometimes survive as outlines or crushed fragments, the way a pressed flower keeps the idea of color. Palynology, the study of pollen, adds a chorus, counting cannabis humulus grains, while grumbling that hop plants are annoyingly similar. Quirky tidbit to tuck under your cheek. Somewhere a curator has placed a post-it on a crusted bowl that reads, "Do not clean the soot for science," which is the closest any museum gets to graffiti. You watch the lab rehearse its caution. Controls, blanks, standards, little bottles of known molecules that keep the machine honest. Walls of the notebook fill with retention times and peaks, each one a small finger-raised ahem. Then the hard questions arrive, the ones our bedtime story refuses to skip. How do you prove this residue is ancient, not modern contamination from handling, conservation varnish, or a clumsy incense demo 50 years ago? Which layer of compacted soot do you sample when the bowl is a layer cake baked over centuries? Historians still argue whether CBN to THC ratios, degradation patterns, and site taphonomy are sufficient to date the smoke event, or whether you must pair chemistry with secure context. Charcoal dates, stratigraphy, co-located offerings, before the claim gets a chair at the grown-ups table. The language of ambiguity becomes your lullaby now. Pollen can say the plant lived nearby, not that someone inhaled it. Seeds in a jar can say medicine or porridge, not method. Residue in a bowl can say plant was heated, not what the breath meant. Purification, grief, laughter, sleep. So the lab borrows friends. It pairs GCMS, the running and sniffing machine, with LCMS, running without a bake-off, with FTIR, shine light, read vibrations, with microscopy and sometimes ancient DNA from charred seeds or surrounding sediments, to ask whether the local cannabis population skewed toward drug-type chemistry or fiber-type restraint. Your first joke arrives wearing nitrile gloves. If repetition built muscle, the grad student scraping pipe bowls would have forearms like myth. You nod at the other headache, the one with shoes on. Context is king, queen, and scheduling director. A pipe fragment from a house floor whispers more about daily habit than an identical fragment reburied as fill. A brazier with plant markers in a grave suggests choreography, remember Pamir, while the same marker in a market stall might be commerce or a lunchtime experiment. Historians still argue whether multi-use vessels, incense today, legume roast tomorrow, can ever yield a clean verdict, or whether we must accept probabilities phrased like weather reports. Likely fumigation, possible admixture, low chance of stew. You check our trio. Fact, oddity, debate. Fact we've pocketed. Laboratories can differentiate heated cannabis signatures from raw plant byproducts and from many common aromatics, giving substance to scenes that texts describe with poetic vagueness. Oddity. Conservators from earlier centuries sometimes waxed or shellacked artifacts to protect them, leaving chemists to subtract those helpful preservatives from the data like a parent scraping frosting off a child's breakfast. Debate. Whether a single positive bowl or brazier in a neighborhood means household habit, or a specialist's toolkit that moved from house to house the way a fiddler moves the party. Evidence doesn't only live in potsherds. Human tissues can speak too. Hair and teeth sometimes hold residues of what passed through blood. Ash layers inside buildings can preserve the molecular memory of many evenings. Even the soot on ceilings becomes a ledger if you're patient, and your sampling wand is persuasive. You think of our steppe tent, and imagine a scientist swabbing a felt panel, asking history to cough politely. Second joke winks at the cold room fridge. Every lab has a container labeled, "Do not eat, not even if you're doing science." And someone, somewhere, has considered it. The lab's ego is unusually well raised. It keeps reminding you what it can't do. It can't say who inhaled, only that someone heated. It can't disentangle the first date of a practice from the oldest surviving residue. Survival is its own lottery. It can't tell whether shouting in a tent meant ecstasy, cleansing, or the rocks are louder than we are. Historians still argue whether to broaden smoking, to include any intentional inhalation of heated plant vapors, our sliders left and middle, or to reserve it for device-mediated draws, the right, and whether the lab's language should follow anthropology's inclusiveness or lexicography's caution. Your third joke arrives like a peak on a chromatogram. Sharp, satisfying, gone too fast. If a modern app tried to visualize this work, it would turn each mass spec peak into a skyscraper and sell City of Molecules posters to people who haven't cleaned their stovetops. You smile, then set the joke down next to the pipette. The seriousness here is real but gentle. Patient methods asking imprecise centuries to sit still long enough for one more reading. Before you leave, the lab gives you a parting gift, a way to hold uncertainty without losing sleep. Stack converging lines, material culture, the bowls and braziers, context, where they were, with what, chemistry, what the soot remembers, and text, who bragged in ink. When 2 lines agree, you have intrigue. When 3 agree, you have confidence. When 4 hum the same note, you may at last call it an answer and go to bed. You pocket that rule like a bedtime mint. On your way out, you pat the tent, the brazier, the pipe in your memory, and nod at the spectral city of peaks on the monitor. They all say the same thing in different dialects. Heat invited breath. Breath accepted. The arguments tidy the edges, not the heart. Your fan at home takes over the hum. Your eyelids obey. The machines keep purring for someone on the night shift who is, as always, measuring what the old evenings meant. You lie back and sort the table, the things we can point at, and the things that wiggle when pointed at. Start with the firm stones. Mainstream historical fact. By the 5th century BCE, people in the Pamir highlands burned potent cannabis in braziers, leaving heat-altered residues that laboratories can still identify, which makes intentional inhalation more than a poetic hunch. The tent we visited in the steppe texts lines up with the physics we smelled. The lab's chromatograms nod along like polite owls. Earlier than that, burials like Yanghai prove the plant was curated and valued. Later than that, pipes and chillums turn breath into a portable ritual, and in bustling cities, hashish earns both poems and prohibitions. A line emerges even if it's stitched from different colors of thread. Now the softer pile, the fuzzier things that put their elbows on the table. Your slider has done good work, but definitions keep testing the fence. Is fumigation in a closed tent smoking, or is smoking only when a device makes lungs the star of the show? Historians still argue whether to broaden the verb to include any deliberate inhalation of heated plant vapors, or reserve it for pipe and kin draws. You can almost hear a dictionary clearing its throat while an anthropologist waves from the back. Please notice the people. You split the difference in your pillow. Intent plus inhalation. In the club. Gadgets. VIP seating. You count the evidence types the way a shepherd counts by touch. Texts brag or warn. Artifacts hold soot like diaries. Chemistry points to molecules that only appear when heat has had its say. Context, grave, house, market, translates all the above into behavior rather than accidents. When 2 lines agree, you get confidence. When 3 sing, you get courage. When 4 hum the same chord, you can finally whisper answer and turn down the lamp. Quirky tidbit to tuck under your cheek. Some museums now label crusted bowls, "Please do not clean, seriously," which is the conservation equivalent of putting a pastry under glass and asking everyone to stop breathing dessert. The gaps are honest. We don't have a single inventor, a patent date, a ribbon cutting for the first official inhale. What we have are convergences. Mountain mourners discovering that a calm ember carries a mood. Tent traditions treating air like a guest that needs feeding. Households and sailors shrinking rooms into cups and pipes. Water teaching heat to use its indoor voice. Cities negotiating between habit and edict. Historians still argue whether the Pamir braziers reflect primarily ecstatic mourning or cleansing rituals. Whether Scythian steam tents lean toward aromatic hemp or resin-rich heads. Whether early Ethiopian bowls were cannabis first or aromatic generalists before tobacco taught the world a new grammar for draw and pass. You stack the jokes lightly where they won't squeak. First, if repetition built muscle, our slider would qualify as gym equipment, and the word smoking would have its own personal trainer. Second, somewhere a bureaucrat genuinely believes you can measure neighborhood intoxication by poem length after midnight. If only funding worked that way. Third, if labs sold posters of mass spec skylines, dorm rooms would be full of City of Molecules, and someone would ask if the CBN district has good coffee. You run your hand over the grain of continuity. Every method we met is really the same sentence with different punctuation. Heat invites, air carries, lungs consent, meaning attaches. Sometimes the comma is mourning. Sometimes it's pain relief. Sometimes it's a story that behaves better when rounded at the edges. The plant's breath has never traveled alone. It rode with incense into sanctuaries, with tobacco into hardware, with sweets into salons, with work into rope walks and sail lofts. This is why the question, when did people start smoking weed, resists a single date the way a cat resists a leash. You get a century, a practice, and an accumulation. You check yourself for present tense bias. It's easy to backfill modern cylinders and filters into older evenings. So you keep the left side of our slider honest. Tents and braziers count, as long as intention and inhalation hold hands. You keep the right side respectful. Pipes and water pipes are not the invention of intoxication, just its fine-grained controls. Historians still argue whether to privilege devices as the true beginning, or to see them as late refinements of an older climate. You don't referee, you lull. You keep both in the room so sleep can choose. One more firm stone before we dim the lamp. The earliest direct evidence we can currently trust is still that high Pamir ember. Residue that behaved like a witness with its oath taken. Around it we arranged contexts, songs, gadgets, and arguments. The picture is steady enough to cradle. By the 5th century BCE, someone is smoldering potent cannabis so others can breathe it together. By the medieval centuries, people start putting the room in their hand. By the early modern period, the hardware learns to burble and the law learns to lecture. You exhale and let the table clear itself. The fan at home is a small, loyal wind. Our last stop will fold the pieces into a quiet, ember-red fade. The answer tucked. The edges softened, so your eyes can do what the old rooms taught lungs to do. Let go on purpose. You let the lights in your room dim to embers and hold the answer like a warm coin. The line we followed is not a fuse that burns to one dramatic spark. It's a trail of well-kept coals. Mainstream historical fact to keep on your bedside table. By the 5th century BCE in the Pamir highlands, people smoldered potent cannabis in braziers and breathed the warmed vapors together, leaving heat-altered residues labs can still read. Everything else, tents that behave like lungs, bowls that act like rooms, pipes that put weather in your hand, water that teaches heat to use its indoor voice, braids around that ember like kindling placed with care. You name your favorites once more so they'll line up in sleep. The Yanghai stash that proved value before method. The steppe steam tent that turned enclosure into collaboration. The mountain braziers that gave chemistry a diary. The Ethiopian bowls and Indian chillums that shrank ritual into a draw. The urban hashish nights that taught law to write, erase, and rewrite the same paragraph. The hookahs that gurgled social time into even portions. The salons that traded spoons and similes. The labs that stacked peaks like a skyline until history hummed along. Quirky tidbit to tuck back under your cheek before you go. Somewhere, a coconut shell is still moonlighting as a water pipe base, and it remains stubbornly photogenic. You keep a seat for uncertainty without letting it stand over you. Historians still argue whether fumigation deserves the name smoking, or whether the term belongs only to device-mediated draws, and they still argue whether early scenes were ecstatic mourning, cleansing, or comfort with psychoactive effect as design or side effect. You don't have to referee, you only have to remember the hinge, intentional heat meeting, intentional breath. Wherever that happens on purpose, you're close enough to the first smokers to hear their room exhale. Your 3 pocket jokes yawn and fold themselves neatly. If repetition built muscle, your slider of methods would have a 6-pack. If a magistrate measured intoxication by poem length, a sober tailor would still ruin the data. If labs sold City of Molecules posters, someone would hang one and forget to clean the stovetop it was meant to improve. They've done their work, kept your shoulders loose while dates and tools arrange themselves. Now you turn the question one last time in slow light. When did people start smoking weed? Not with a cigarette's crisp cylinder and a brand logo, that's a modern costume, but with a brazier's calm, a stone's blush, a bowl's small climate. Long before glass learned to burble, rooms learned to breathe, and people invited that breath inside theirs. The earliest direct proof calls from 500 BCE. The habits that flank it, storage, ritual, tinkering, arrive earlier and later like careful neighbors who know when to knock. You promise yourself one gentle callback for tomorrow's memory. When someone tells you the history is simple, pipes began it, or ancients didn't inhale, or hookahs invented the whole idea, you'll smile like a person who's been to the mountains at night. You've seen how tool and ritual take turns leading, how trade teaches households to experiment, how law practices disappointment and custom practices endurance, how evidence is a choir, not a solo. You'll answer softly. It starts when heat invites breath and breath accepts, and we can hear that acceptance clearly by the time mourners on a high ridge warm a bowl and share the air. Your fan resumes its honest job. The room shrinks to the size of your breathing. The planet outside keeps its appointments with wind and night shift, and you keep yours with the quilt. If evidence had a lullaby, it would be this: tents, bowls, pipes, water, spoons, peaks, a method for every century, a patience for every argument. You are allowed to sleep with partial answers. History approves. The coals are banked. The story will be warm in the morning. Let everything soften now. The map can fold itself. The mountains can keep their crisp edges without asking your eyes to follow them. Give the room the rhythm you like. A long inhale that feels like standing by a window. A longer exhale that feels like lowering a blind. Let the phrases we used grow rounder and slower until they become shapes more than sentences. Tent, bowl, ember, breath, fan, pillow, quiet. Picture one small brazier you can cup with both hands. No hurry, no ceremony, only a steady warmth like a calm animal. The air above it is barely visible, a shimmer that could be memory or heat. Someone you trust lifts a palm and adjusts nothing. It was already right. In that certainty, your shoulders unlock by a finger's width. The jaw follows, then the mouth rests the way a door rests when it knows it is closed. Outside, if you want, there is a road. On it, caravans do what caravans always do. Arrive late and exactly on time. A lantern swings. A bell counts. None of it requires you. Inside, the weather keeps good manners. The fan is the quietest river. Your breath is the smallest boat. Let the facts go dim like coals under ash, present, safe, unwilling to startle. If a thought returns with sharp corners, draw a curtain of longer sentences around it until the edges dull and the thought agrees to wait at the threshold. You can keep one image if you like. A ridge at dusk, a low bowl, friends gathered not to fix anything, but to be the kind of near that teaches the night to behave. Stay. Float half an inch above the mattress. Let the room breathe you, and let yourself be breathed. The ember has gone from orange to memory. Nothing more is needed. Sleep.